Okay, well, welcome everyone. I was asking our esteemed panel here how long we've been at this, and it's over 3 years that we've been raising money from you to do research, and now we're moving into a remediation phase based on the research that many of you helped to fund. And I have to say that your private contributions to the Sagg Pond Restoration Fund, we have used to leverage public support through the town's WQIP program, water quality program, which is part of the Community Preservation Fund. So it's a great public-private partnership. We've learned a lot about what it means to live in the Sagg Pond watershed. We understand how septic systems and fertilization of lawns and legacy fertilizers from farms all get into our groundwater, and then that flows into Sagg Pond. These are all the basics we've learned. You'll hear them again tonight. But the real reason we're here tonight is to talk about what's ahead. And we have some exciting news that we'll be hearing from Ron and Molly about their work and sort of next steps, and then from Bruce Horwith, who's the Trust's natural resources consultant, about septic systems and where we want to go with that as well. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Molly and Ron, who will introduce themselves more fulsomely if they so desire.
Hello, welcome, and thank you for tuning in to our presentation tonight, where we're providing an update about Sagg Pond and water quality in the watershed. My name is Molly Graffam, and I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I graduated from Stony Brook University School of Marine Science, and I worked for the Center for Clean Water Technology for a while, working on wastewater treatment and nitrogen removing biofilters, as well as groundwater treatment and permeable erective barriers. And then I was able to continue that research now that I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension, and that's what the presentation will be mostly focused on tonight. Ron, did you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ron Paulsen. I also work under the Cornell flag, although I am under contract with them. So, but I did work directly for them for over 25 years. But this work now I do is through a different mechanism, but nothing really has changed with that collaboration with Cornell. So hydrogeologist, I've been studying embayments and groundwater on Long Island for 25, 30 years. So happy to bring all that knowledge and experience to help what we believe and we're very hopeful for will be actually some remedies that will help the pond in future years.
So we're going to be talking a lot about water quality and nitrogen and some water quality issues that have been happening at Sagg Pond. But I'd like to start by just introducing several different environmental conditions that are kind of acting in a combination as threats to Sagg Pond water quality. First is, we know that temperatures in the Northeast US are increasing rapidly, and higher temperatures exacerbate the nitrogen problem by speeding up algae growth, reducing dissolved oxygen in water, and fish rely on that oxygen in the water to breathe. So definitely an issue there. We know that population and land use is changing. Population density has been on the rise, and land use has been changing. More homes and more people equates to more excessive nitrogen inputs, especially by fertilizer and septic inputs. And then there's the issue of toxic algae, which you may have heard of the term harmful algae blooms. They've been detected in Sagg Pond each summer, and they tend to flourish when temperatures are high, when light conditions are high, and they produce and release a neurotoxin, which is toxic to humans and pets. And as those algae sink towards the bottom of the pond, they also cause oxygen declines. And in 2021, we found that Sagg Pond surface water had 2 to 6 times higher nitrogen concentration than is generally accepted as healthy. And the current and anticipated threats are exacerbating the harmful effects of nitrogen pollution, which is it's putting the pond wildlife and biodiversity at risk. So this is unfortunately why, we're experiencing water quality issues, and it's something that we really have to pay attention to. Just to go over some of the background information that we know about the subwatershed from the Suffolk County Subwatershed Plan, we know that groundwater within the surrounding land area is contributing to the water body. If this forms the subwatershed. The map on the left side is showing the modeled groundwater travel times. So groundwater travel time in the Sagg Pond subwatershed ranges from 0 up to 25 years. And we know that Long Island sandy soils, and specifically sandy soils in the Sagg region, are susceptible to leaching nutrients like nitrogen and other pollutants. It makes the underlying groundwater vulnerable to contamination. And the groundwater travel time is relatively slow. So nitrogen that's added to the orange and yellow regions of the subwatershed today will actually continue to enter the pond for years and decades. And nitrogen entering the pond today is a combination of both new or fresh nitrogen and partly legacy or old nitrogen. We also have information about the water table elevation and the contours, which are shown in the map on the right. Those light blue lines are modeled water table elevation contours. And the closer the contour lines are together, the faster the modeled groundwater flow is. So we can look at this and start to get a sense of where groundwater discharge rates are expected to be highest. And we use this to help guide our field survey. And we also know that the saltwater interface that's deeper in the aquifer, it confines and focuses fresh groundwater at the shoreline to relatively shallow depths. So we've actually been able to install some wells and take measurements, and we found that the saltwater interface is in that 50 to 60 foot zone, depending on where you are in along the pond. Ron's gonna give some more background information about the terminology that we're using today.
Yeah, we just want to, I'm sure some of you have heard this before, but I think it's good we kind of go over the terms we're going to use to explain the results. And, specifically, when we say pour water, what does that really mean? So I just want to take a minute and go over, this is just a cross section, a generalized cross section of what our aquifer system looks like throughout Suffolk County. It varies in different ways, but basically we have this unconfined aquifer near the shoreline. As Molly said, there's this brackish water beneath it, and the driving force for all of this fresh water is the fact that the water table inland is higher than the surface water. And as you would, guess, water wants to flow downhill. So that's really the, very simplified way of looking at it. And what happens is near the shoreline, because of that drive, you will get areas of submarine groundwater discharge. And those are the areas that bring the contaminants and such, or just the need of fresh water in these estuaries. So it's a healthy thing, but if it's loaded with nutrients or other contaminants, it can be problematic. But you could see, where the W and the HT are, though, this is the discharge area near the shoreline. And right below the sediment line is pore water. And that's what we sample and measure. And that's how we determine, how this groundwater is impacting the pond. So the cross section again on the upper left, it's a little more realistic in the sense that it shows how different land uses, including, homes, septic tanks, obviously ag and other, higher density, housing and all these different things add nutrients, as well as precipitation, because atmospheric deposition is also where we pick up nitrogen that will infiltrate into the groundwater. So you have multiple sources. And as Molly said, there's a legacy. It takes decades sometimes for this water to work its way to shoreline. And so if you follow the precipitation through the infiltration, through the water table, then the groundwater all focuses and travels to the shoreline. And again, that's where the submarine groundwater discharge is. Offshore below, there's seawater. So the groundwater is less dense, so it stays on top of the seawater. That's why we have a saltwater interface beneath, many of the areas, and certainly beneath Sagg Pond at depth 100 or 200 feet down, would all be saltwater. So those are the basic principles that are at play. There's other things that go on with exchange of water, but the big one is the groundwater drive that brings all of these, different sources and contaminants and such to our surface water. So how do we go about this? We want to map out that submarine groundwater discharge zone that we saw in those cross sections. And the one way to do it in the first diagram on the left is something we call a pore water probe that has that's inserted into the into the sediment bottom, and we draw samples out of that. And we also measure for things like temperature and conductance and other field parameters. And all of those things help us map out where the fresh water is. So we can use all those measurements of the pore water to determine where the submarine groundwater discharge is, and the samples, which we had 225 samples in our survey, which is, pretty robust and pretty comprehensive throughout the Sagg Pond embayment. So those samples, we did collect, and Molly will go over some of those results. The middle picture shows the other thing we use is what we call a seepage meter. And we want to measure the flow rate of that pore water coming out. And this meter goes into the sediment, has a funnel collection on the bottom, and then that water is funneled through an ultrasonic flow tube that's sensitive enough to measure those flow rates. And that's important because now if you have a concentration and a flow rate, and you have the area of discharge, you can start to identify the areas that have high loads of nitrogen using these tools. Other things that control where this groundwater goes is the sediment type. In many areas of the pond, it was, relatively coarse material, but in some areas of the pond, there was feet of muck layers that developed over the years, because with the excess nutrients, you get these muck layers, and they will build up in time. So we look at all these features, shoreline features. There's usually a preferential areas on the shoreline, and we collect depth of water, GPS, and so we create these maps then of these priority areas in the shoreline that are high discharge areas for nitrogen.
Moving on to some of the results that Ron was just describing with these maps that we're able to create by first going on a boat with the pore water probe, getting the information, then once we collect all this information, we can map it. And so that's what you're seeing here. These maps are updated as of 2022. So they include some new data. If you were at our presentation last year, these maps might look familiar. So this is a combination of the 2021 and 2022 data. We found that pore water nitrate ranged from basically less than detection limit all the way up to 16 milligrams of nitrogen per liter. 16 milligrams of nitrogen is very excessively high. Just to put that in perspective, the drinking water standard is 10 milligrams nitrogen per liter, and healthy water bodies would tend to have less than 0.4 milligrams nitrate per liter. So the pore water is quite elevated in nitrogen in some of these areas. In fact, over 50% of the pore water samples that we collected had greater than 2 milligrams per liter as nitrate. So again, very excessive nitrogen levels. We would typically think that a level of about 1 milligram per liter in the groundwater would be relatively like pristine for the upper glacial aquifer. So again, very high nitrogen concentrations in the pore water. And they happen to be in specific areas. If you could tell from the map on the far left, the area closest to the ocean, those areas had very little nitrate concentration, whereas the northern area and the western shoreline had the high nitrate concentration. So it's not the same everywhere, and there was a clear north-south gradient in nitrate concentration in the pore water. As Ron mentioned, we also had certain stations where we collected the flow rate, and we found that the rates north of Bridge Lane were always positive and were tending to be higher on the west side, which confirmed what we were expecting based on the modeled water table elevation contours. And actually at certain areas closer to the ocean, we measured negative discharge rates, which means that water from the pond was actually recharging into the sediment and going back down into the ground. So that was a really interesting result. And although it might seem like the water is kind of stagnant at times, there is really circulation of groundwater flowing in, especially on the northern and western shorelines. And then in some areas, especially closer to the ocean, water was actually going back down into the groundwater and recharging. And we have conductivity measurements as well. So conductivity, you could just think of that as salinity, and that ranged from very fresh and influenced by groundwater, shown by the bright yellow color, to very salty and influenced by seawater, shown by that dark red color. So the shoreline areas, and especially the northern and western side of Sagg Pond, were again highly influenced by groundwater. And one of the key findings that we found from 2021, which we just happened to be out there collecting data on groundwater discharge rate when the ocean inlet was opened. And so we had our meter out there. It was located, if you look on the map, the yellow star shows where we had our seepage meter when the ocean inlet was opened. And we captured the measurements as the pond water level dropped. The groundwater discharge flow rate increased by 4 times in that area. So the flow rate went from 50 milliliters per minute all the way up above 200 milliliters per minute. And that was because the pressure gradient between the water table and the pond water level increased because the pond water level dropped. And so that pressure gradient increase caused an increase in groundwater discharge rate. So we thought that this was a really interesting result, and we reproduced this. This occurred in multiple locations, and then actually in one area where we were measuring negative flow rates when the pond ocean inlet was opened, we measured positive flow rates. So we went from negative to positive in an area that we were measuring towards the ocean side. So very interesting results with respect to the groundwater seepage rates. Moving on, we'd like to mostly focus on what we did in 2022, which is phase 2 of this work. So in 2021, we mostly performed phase 1, which is the pore water survey, the offshore work. And in phase 2, now that we've identified specific shoreline areas that have high groundwater flow rates and elevated nutrient concentrations, we can then move inland and do site characterization on properties along the shoreline that will help us to help install remediation. So this work was actually largely moved forward because we have access to this piece of equipment that you're looking at on the screen now called the geoprobe. Cornell was awarded a grant through the USDA to purchase this geoprobe, and this has really helped our research move forward. So the geoprobe is about the size of a pickup truck, and it's track mounted, so it can be moved by remote control, which is what you see in the photo. For the phase 2 site characterization work, we focused on 3 properties along the Sagg Pond shoreline. Site 1 was a preserved property, site 2 was an agricultural property, and then site 3 was a residential property. And these properties were kind of scattered around Sagg Pond. So the preserve area just happened to be in a low groundwater flow area. The agricultural property happens to be in a moderate groundwater flow area, and then the residential property happens to be in a high groundwater flow area. So for this site characterization work, we collected additional pore water samples offshore of the properties, and we compared that with the 2021 results. We found that the pore water again contained elevated nitrogen. So this confirmed that this was not just a fluke that we measured in 2021, but this is consistently high values that we're measuring. We also collected soil borings on each site and analyzed the soil for grain size analysis. We also installed temporary wells about 50 to 100 feet inland from the shoreline, and then they were installed about 50 to 100 feet apart along the shoreline according to what we measured in the pore water. And doing this soil analysis is really important because collecting the soil borings can tell us a lot about the existing soil and how we can move forward with remediation installation. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this type of remediation called a permeable reactive barrier, or PRB, but it's typically a combination of coarse sand, wood chips, and gravel, and we'll also be looking into other amendments as the research continues. But the grain size analysis helps to determine this parameter called hydraulic conductivity of the soil. And then once we know the natural hydraulic conductivity of the soil, we can use that information to make sure that our remediation, our PRB media, has a higher hydraulic conductivity than the surrounding soil. So water is actually going to be attracted into the barrier and flow through it passively. So we're looking for soil that is, well, we'd like to know if the soil is relatively permeable. For example, if it has these pore spaces, we want to know that, and we want to know, what we need to aim for to install the permeable reactive barrier, what hydraulic conductivity we need to aim for. And that's why we're doing the soil boring collection. So what we found from this is just an example of one of the cores from the agricultural site, from the deeper zone in the core. We found about 6% gravel. A lot of the soil was sand, which was what we expected, ranging from very coarse sand to very fine sand, and we did not find much silt or clay. So that was very telling, and that makes sense because the sands tend to allow nutrients to be delivered to the aquifer. So all of this information was kind of making sense, and now we can use this information as we go forward to help design our remediation. So we also installed temporary profile wells, and we sampled them. So what the movie that's playing right now is just showing how we install temporary profile wells to about 35 to 40 feet deep, and I can play this video again, but we install them to 40 feet deep, and they have a screen zone on them. So we're collecting a sample from a 5-foot screen zone, and then we actually pull the wells up and we remove parts of the well, and they're just 5-foot sections of PVC that we remove at a time. So we can actually profile and create a cross section of the groundwater and nitrogen concentrations in the aquifer. And then the picture that you're looking at on the left just shows what the wells look like from the surface. You know, these are the wells themselves are 1-inch diameter. The well covers that you're seeing in the photo are about 6-inch diameter. You know, this photo was when the wells were just installed. So the ground, you know, the grass just grows around these wells and they are barely visible by the end of the season. But I'll just play this video one more time so that you can see we're pulling 5-foot sections of well out of the ground at a time, and we're profiling the groundwater aquifer, sampling it for nitrogen, and that allows us to create some cross sections that I will show you now. So our data here, we're looking at the vertical distance below grade for each of these 3 plots. So the top of the plot is showing grade level, and then we went 40 feet into the aquifer with these temporary profile wells. And then on the x-axis, you're looking at horizontal distance from south to north. So you can think of the 0 area as like the start of the property, and then moving north as you move to the right. So for the preserve area, which was in a low groundwater discharge zone, we did not find any nitrate really. There was 0 nitrate in the aquifer there. At site 2, we found, especially in the 20 to 40 foot below grade zone, we found elevated nitrogen concentrations all the way up to 16 milligrams per liter. And this was in the moderate groundwater flow zone. And then at the residential site, which was in a high groundwater flow zone, again, we found elevated concentrations, moderate concentrations at that 20 to 40 feet below level. So there's a lot going on here, but we're primarily going to focus on the agricultural and residential site because we did find the nitrate plume there. And we found that the highest groundwater nitrate, again, was in that 20 to 40 foot below grade zone. The groundwater present at the shoreline, the fact that we found it from 20 to 40 feet indicates that that nitrogen originates from further inland within the subwatershed. So this is probably the most important part, and something, you know, that we weren't sure what to expect, but the fact that we found it between 20 to 40 feet below grade indicates that that nitrogen was originally sourced from further within the subwatershed, and the land use is really important to consider. So currently it's primarily residential properties, which many lack upgraded septic systems. And then historically the land use was agricultural. So we can infer from our data that the nitrogen present at the shoreline, you know, reflects conditions from 0 to 20 years in the past, because we know the groundwater travel time is in that range, and it's a combination of septic as well as maybe legacy fertilizer and those atmospheric sources. The great news is that because we found this nitrogen plume in that 20 to 40 foot zone, that's well within the range of us being able to treat that groundwater nitrogen with the types of remediation that we've been focusing on, which is permeable reactive barriers. Just briefly, I wanted to cover some other work that we've been doing in the subwatershed at Sagg Pond. So over the summer, we were very busy, both at Sagg and Sagg. We did a survey similar to what we did at Sagg Pond. So I'm showing the different stations that we were able to sample at Sagg. That's a picture of me in the middle of the pond. And the star on this map here shows approximately where I'm standing in the pond. But that was actually probably an hour after I had come into an encounter with a snapping turtle. So a lot of interesting things happening at the pond. But what was surprising was that there was very little water there. You can see the pond had started to dry up. You know, we had quite a bit of a drought over the summer, and the the water levels were quite low. So we do plan on performing more measurements at the seasonal high water table. Right now, we've collected this data at the seasonal low water table conditions. So just quickly showing some maps similar to what we had just shown for Sagg Pond, but now for Sagg Pond. We collected pore water and we plotted these stations. We found actually that the majority of nitrogen was in the form of TKN, which is a combination of organic nitrogen and ammonium. And there were basically throughout the pond, there were below detectable levels of nitrate. Now, this is important because the permeable reactive barriers, which I'm going to go over in a few minutes, they primarily are able to remove nitrate. So we will definitely be collecting more information at the seasonal high water table conditions. And we have a lot more work to do at this site, but we are starting to get a handle on what's happening at this pond. Now on to the most positive and hopeful part of the talk. We're working on these promising remediation approaches called permeable reactive barriers. They are sustainable. They use natural materials like sand, wood chips, and gravel. They rely on naturally occurring microbes to transform nitrate, which is the nutrient and pollutant that we've been talking about. It transforms it into a harmless gas, which is nitrogen gas, which is already 80% of our atmosphere, and we're breathing it in right now. It's totally harmless. And PRBs are passive. They require no energy input after installation. They've also been found to be cost effective because after installation, they last for decades without maintenance. And they've been proven to have a similar cost efficiency to other passive nitrogen removal over several decades, such as a 20-year period. They're also resilient to seawater intrusion, resilient to adapting water levels, to rising water levels, and there are no above ground structures after installation. We have been monitoring one permeable reactive barrier that was installed in Hampton Bays. It was installed in combination with bulkhead replacement. And since bulkheads provide no environmental benefit, by installing the permeable reactive barrier behind the bulkhead during the replacement, we were able to save costs because the machinery was already there and it was providing an environmental benefit to this situation. So we set up this experiment where we have 4 different types of treatment here. We have the control, which was just native sand. We have a 2.5-foot thick permeable reactive barrier, a 5-foot thick barrier, and then a PRB column approach. And the idea here was to start to look at different designs of PRBs so that we can determine which design is the most effective and just how to improve the design and how we can start to understand how much wood chips do we really need to treat all the nitrogen. And this area we had already done a lot of work on, so we knew that this was a very high groundwater flow rate zone and it had very high nitrogen concentrations. So I'm showing some data here that we collected in April 2022 on the performance of this barrier. And it was installed in 2020. So we've been monitoring this system since 2020, and it's consistently removed 80 to 100% of nitrate, whereas the control zones, which have native sand, do not provide that same benefit of nitrogen removal. So looking at this graph here, we have nitrate on the y-axis and then up gradient within the PRB and down gradient of the PRB on that x-axis. The first thing you should notice is that the controls shown in the black color, there's really no change in nitrate concentration from up gradient of the PRB, or that's untreated water within the PRB, and then down gradient of the PRB, there is no change for the control areas that have native sand. Whereas for the areas that have wood chips and gravel and that PRB media behind the bulkhead, we see a significant reduction in nitrate to below detection limit levels. There is a trend where the 5-foot thick barrier treats the nitrate almost right away. And so there's already below detection level limits about halfway in the PRB. Whereas with the column approach, there was still a little bit of nitrate left in the PRB effluent, or, you know, down gradient of the PRB. So we are looking at ways to improve that column approach, because it is it's a less intrusive way to install a PRB. We think it's going to be more cost efficient, and we're looking at ways to improve that, but we already know that it is working quite well. Just to let you know about another project that we have going on in 3 Mile Harbor, we are working on a liquid carbon injection PRB. And that's the video playing. This was in this summer. I took a video. It's in the construction phase. So this is kind of mid-construction phase of this permeable reactive barrier, but we're looking at ways to inject liquid carbon into the ground to promote the microbial community that we want to promote, to reduce nitrate, similar to how the wood chips are reducing nitrate levels. And this is just another way that we're looking at being less intrusive. So trenching is the most intrusive, but these PRB column approaches and the injection approach are much less intrusive. So we're looking at optimizing these different ways to treat nitrate. Just finishing up here, we are focusing on Sagg Pond for many reasons, but why Sagg Pond? You might be wondering, why should we really be focusing our efforts here? Well, the shape of Sagg Pond is unique. It's got a very extensive shoreline and relatively shallow water depth. So because it has that extensive shoreline, that's a lot of area where groundwater is discharging into the shallow surface water. We know that the land use is largely privately owned, both residential and agricultural. And in these privately owned areas, we've had great success with moving projects along quickly. So with the permission of the property owner, we can get this installed quickly. The magnitude of the nitrogen pollution problem, unfortunately, we are measuring some extremely high nitrate levels in the pore water, and the surface water in certain areas has up to 16 times higher than what is considered healthy for a water body. So we know the pollution problem is quite extensive here. We also know the saltwater interface is present at about 60 feet below the water table, and that saltwater interface confines and focuses fresh groundwater at the shoreline. So we're able to treat groundwater that's the groundwater that's pretty deep in the aquifer is being focused at the shoreline. So we're really able to install a treatment at the shoreline, which will remove nitrogen before it directly impacts Sagg Pond. And we know that Sagg Pond while it is severely impaired, it has not yet reached an irreversible critical threshold. So we believe that there's hope here. We know that Sagg Pond is a unique place, and it's an ideal place to invest heavily in remediation, because we can restore water quality and help preserve the pond for the future. There are ways that you can help improve and maintain Sagg Pond. We are in the midst of this project, so we are looking for property owners to provide access to key shoreline areas based on our work. Thus far, we know certain areas just happen to culminate nitrogen, whether it's because of the inland land use or the soil properties or the groundwater flow. Certain areas happen to have these properties that allow groundwater to discharge into the pond. So we're looking to collaborate with property owners, and you can allow us to do site characterization work and determine if potentially a PRB is viable. We are looking for support. Donations to the Sagg Pond Restoration Fund will go directly towards researching and installing these treatments, and they provide immediate water quality benefits. So our work cannot be done without your support. And we're looking to help prevent further water quality deterioration. So updating your septic systems, I know Bruce Horwith will probably talk about that next, and improving your lawn care and fertilization practices. Those are ways that you can also help. And then, of course, you are on this call tonight. Thank you for joining, and please stay informed. The Land Trust and Cornell, we give this public presentation yearly, and then we give donors and property owners who are participating in the project, they receive more detailed reports on the water quality status and the performance of the remediation. So just lastly, we want to emphasize that this is an ongoing project, and the problem was created over a series of decades. So it's not going to be solved in one swoop. There's a lot of things that need to happen to help continue to solve this problem and to help maintain the water quality, also help maintain the habitat biodiversity, and of course, maintain the public enjoyment. So we are looking at probably we're planning on a 3 to 5 year approach with this phased approach of getting in more remediation over the next few years. And like John mentioned earlier, we're looking to allow, get privately funded donations and then use that as leverage to match with the public money available through the Community Preservation Fund. And we've been successful in doing that so far. So we're looking to continue that approach. And I'd like to just say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the Peconic Land Trust for thank you to the groundwater team that we, have been working very tirelessly throughout the summer at Sagg Pond and Sagg Pond. And thank you to the members and donors so far, especially Philippa Weissman and the Goldman Foundation. Philippa was generous enough to open her house to hold an event over the summer, and that was very helpful. And then to the town of Southampton trustees, the board, the committee, thank you very much. To the town of East Hampton, we're working with them on a bunch of different PRB projects. And then thank you to the Stony Brook Center for Clean Water Technology and DEC. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to hold the questions until we give Bruce Horwith, our natural resources consultant, an opportunity to talk about the work that we're initiating in conjunction with the Center for Clean Water Technology and Septics. So Bruce, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess by way of introduction, as John said, I'm a natural resource consultant. I consider myself a conservation biologist. I started working, I guess, initially internationally, came out to the East End in about 25 years ago, working with the Nature Conservancy, then the Trust, and independently. And over, I think I've been working now with the Trust probably for about 10 years on various projects, most recently on Sagg Pond. I'm going to share the screen at this point, hopefully. And move into the presentation. So what I'm going to be doing is talking to you for a couple minutes about these systems called IA systems. It stands for Innovative Alternative Systems. Basically, you want to just be thinking in terms of nitrogen reducing systems. And if you'll bear with me, can you see this here? Everybody can see this?
I think you can make it a full screen though.
Let me, hold on.
Yeah, that's a little better.
No, not as good.
No, it's not actually very full. Let's see.
It was okay before.
Let me go back to that.
There you go.
That's the best.
Bruce, I think if you hit slideshow at the
I'm
top
trying
of
to,
the toolbar to the right, it says slideshow next to animations, but
There you go. Yeah.
Is that working better? You may not be able to see all this at this point, but what I'm showing, I'm sort of bringing it back to school for a minute. I'm showing you the nitrogen cycle since that's what we're focusing on tonight. And I'll just quickly go through a couple things that I think will make it easier to understand what IA systems are and how they work. If you think about atmospheric nitrogen, or you think about the air that we're breathing, atmospheric nitrogen is making up 72% of the air, and that's the form that most nitrogen exists in. It can be fixed by bacteria, meaning that it can be converted into a form that we're more familiar with in the land, into ammonia, which can then undergo nitrification by bacteria to nitrate or nitrite, and nitrate. And it's in the form of nitrate that it becomes available to plants and to the animals that eat the plants. And if that decomposes, you get into this smaller internal cycle where the material is available to plants and animals. It goes back to ammonia and it's just cycling in that form. But it's possible for the nitrate to be sort of lost from that internal system and to be denitrified and make it back up to the atmosphere. And if it does that, it becomes part of that larger cycle that I showed you in the beginning. If, on the other hand, it ends up getting into the water bodies or into water, nitrate's extremely soluble. And so it can make it out of that system and either enter into the groundwater as leachate or into the groundwater just in one form or the other, or it can make it into the ponds, which is a problem that we're experiencing in Sagg Pond. The IA system, which I'll go into in a minute, basically it increases the denitrification within the septic system so that more of the nitrates converted back into the atmospheric nitrogen rather than being released as nitrate. So the important part of that cycle is the fact that you have a natural nitrogen cycle, and within it there's denitrification, in which microbes in the soil are converting nitrate and nitrite, which are in excess, are detrimental to the health of ponds, converting them into gaseous forms of nitrogen, which for our purposes becomes harmless. The IA systems, unlike the traditional septic systems, take advantage of this naturally occurring process. So in this picture, it's showing sort of a traditional septic system with a septic tank, the material going out into a leach pit or leach field, and then on to sort of outside the system to wherever it's going to end up going. The whole idea of the IA system is that you're going to insert a denitrification unit in between the septic tank and the leach pit. The actual details of what might be used at any particular home varies depending on a lot of factors, actually. And it may not simply be a question of inserting the denitrification unit between those two, between the septic tank and leachate. It may actually involve a little bit of redesign, but basically it'll be this type of system. So the IA systems have the capability of removing the nitrogen. So that's obviously a big plus for the environment. Nitrogen is the biggest pollutant responsible for lowering the water quality of Sagg Pond. And approximately a quarter of the excess nitrogen in the pond is coming from septic systems within the Sagg Pond watershed. There are other sources of nitrogen, but this is accounting for approximately 1/4 of it. Another reason for installing the IA systems would be the fact that it's sort of becoming, or in some cases is, in other cases will become, a regulatory requirement. As of July in 2021, any new construction or a major renovation, and they don't really exactly define that, but within Suffolk County requires the home to have an IA system. In addition to that, there's quite a bit of subsidy, financial subsidization of the systems. There's substantial grants available for many, if not all, installations. So while the exact amount available for any given home is going to vary, it can be as much as $30,000 from the state and county and $20,000 from the town through the CPF. So it's clear that IA systems are far superior to traditional ones, particularly from an environmental perspective, but it's also equally clear, and it's equally clear they must be a part of any future in which Suffolk County has healthy ponds again. So I guess the obvious question is, given that there's significant financial incentives that already exist, why aren't they more widely in use? And a big part of the problem seems to be just the fact that they're confusing and an unwieldy process that the homeowner encounters. They have not made it very straightforward. And because of this, the trust entered into a partnership with the Stony Brook Center for Clean Water Technology. the CCWT. The center is a research institution that works closely with Suffolk County Department of Health and commercial companies in the IA business to evaluate the nitrogen reducing technologies and monitor their performance under varying environmental site conditions. And really what they're getting at, what I'm trying to get at in this slide, is the fact that there are a couple of commercial IA systems that you probably heard about. They advertise pretty heavily at this point. And it's not clear whether or not they're really performing comparably to one another. It's also not clear that they're each equally suitable for the different conditions that you can encounter in different properties. And so the center is taking on the role of trying to evaluate those different technologies, specifically in terms of how they're working in various locations and why they're performing differently under different environmental site conditions. So we entered into a partnership with the center, and on behalf of the trust, I'll be coordinating with the center, particularly during a startup period, while we await the hiring of a new IA manager position that's being created. The most important thing, I guess, though, the takeaway from that is that all you need to do, you as a homeowner need to do, is to let us know that you might be interested in exploring whether or not an IA system might make sense for you. And from that point on, we'll schedule a site visit to continue the discussion, fill you in more on the background of what some of the systems look like and how they operate. And we do it in the context of the specifics of your property. We'll educate you on the options, because there are a couple different systems to explore. And then after that, it's a question of coordinating with the engineers, the commercial installers, and the regulatory agencies. So basically, we become sort of a one-stop shop for handling the project and assist you throughout the project. At some point in the future, the center will probably take on more of this role, but in the meantime, please feel free to contact me, and I provide some contact information at the bottom of the slide. So I'm not going to really go into any of the specifics at this point of how the systems, or all the steps rather, of how these systems get installed, because it does vary a little bit, and also because it's not really necessary at this stage. But if you're at all interested, we can explore how it might be applied to your property. And that's really the most important thing. So with that, John, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. I just want to say that, again, your support of the Sagg Pond Restoration Fund has been put in part towards the actual hiring at the Clean Water, the Center for Clean Water Technology, to actually be able to hire a person. So I don't know if they've begun the hiring process for that person right now, but we are basically underwriting their ability to perform this service for people in the Sagg Pond watershed. So Amanda, I'm going to kick it back to you, but first let me just recognize Josh Halsey, who's on staff at the trust, as well as Matt Swain, who's our director of stewardship, and Amanda's our director of development, and Josh is our program policy coordinator. So Amanda, you want to take
Hello. Hi, everyone. How are you? So I just want to open it up for questions right now. Like, I know Doug is here, Bob,
Amanda, there's no way I can post anything to the chat. It's disabled.
Oh, well, that's important, but I can hear you speaking. So could you potentially ask?
Oh,
whatever you
okay.
have?
Okay, I'd be happy to. I guess I had a couple of questions for the investigation team. Who ran the analysis, Ron? Who ran the analysis of the samples for the nitrogen compounds?
Hi, Bob. Good to hear you.
Yeah, hi,
yeah,
Ron.
they were, we use a independent lab for that. So,
Who was that, Ron?
Molly, who were for those samples?
We use Long Island Analytical. They're an
Okay.
ELAC certified laboratory.
Okay, yeah, I'm familiar with them. I'm using them myself for what I'm doing here on the western side of the town of Southampton, doing a sort of in my retirement kind of study here locally. So I know who they who they are, and I was going to ask about detection limits, but I know what their detection limits are. The other question I had was, at this point, for at least Sagg Pond, what has been the total cost of the investigation that you guys have done?
A lot.
Well, not a lot. So I think it's been around a few $100,000, correct, Matt?
I mean, that would be between the work with Chris Gobler as well
Right.
early on. So, I mean, yeah, Ron and Molly, you might have a better sense of just for your piece of it thus far.
Yeah, the 2021 survey was approximately $100,000. So we definitely wanted to be very comprehensive about the survey because we knew that Sagg Pond is experiencing quite a few issues, and that because of its extensive shoreline, we really went really comprehensive on the survey. We can modify that approach depending on how extensive and how comprehensive we want to go. But for that survey, that's what that costs. And then with the CPF application, I think we were asking for, again, like about $100,000 to do the site characterization for those 3 properties. And half of that came from the town through the CPF, and I believe half came from the private funded donations.
Donations made to the Sagg Pond Restoration Fund, correct? Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
This is Doug. I have a question if I can be heard.
Go ahead, Doug.
I heard the comment said that it could be that the PRBs are perhaps not particularly effective in intercepting nitrates. And that was raised as a potential concern. So if you wouldn't mind just elaborating a little bit, because the PRBs do seem to be an ideal way for reducing some of the nitrogen loading in the pond. But if there's some aspect about the nature of what's actually being transported to the pond is not in the proper formulation, if I understood you correctly, it sounded like that might be a concern. So if you could just explain a little bit more about that.
Sure. At Sagg Pond, the form of nitrogen that we're finding is predominantly nitrate. And PRBs are extremely well suited for treating nitrate. So at Sagg Pond, that's why we're moving forward with PRBs. They're going to be a great approach to reducing nitrate. And they treat the nitrate regardless of the initial source. So whether it's from agricultural fertilizers, residential septic, or atmospheric, as long as it's in the form of nitrate at that shoreline, which is what we're finding, then PRBs are going to be able to treat that nitrogen. Maybe what you might be referring to is at Sagg Pond. So far, we've found the predominant form of nitrogen is TKN, which is the sum of ammonia and organic nitrogen. And we did not find much nitrate there, but we also, because of the water table conditions, we're not really seeing much groundwater discharge at that time. And we're looking to redo and take more measurements at the seasonal high water table conditions. And we're expecting to observe more groundwater flow and perhaps more groundwater nitrate at that time.
Thanks, Molly, for clarifying. It was exactly that confusion. It was Sagg Pond versus Sagg Pond. So I understand the issues at Sagg are different.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, we did this during, well, quote, drought time, where the pond was receding. And basically, the surface water can affect the pore water in those shallow sediments. So we don't know, we'll know better the next go round, but one of the thoughts is that organic form is actually the surface water that's getting into the sediments and the pore water, because there isn't a groundwater discharge at this point, because it was in retreat. So, ponds are a little trickier because, they're closed systems. They have areas of recharge and they have areas of discharge. And so, there's more to be done there, but, that is possibly one other explanation, along with obviously a large bird population there that's adding other forms. So it's, we'll have a much better feel for it when we're there during the groundwater, like Molly said, that when the groundwater is higher and more robust and we see discharge. So we hope to sort that out in the next round.
Thanks. One follow-up question, that is, do you find a pattern with respect to the changes in hydraulic conductivity and permeability around the pond, i.e., was it more permeable, hydraulic conductivity higher as you get closer to the ocean, or vice versa?
On Poxabog or on Sagg?
At Sagg Pond.
At Sagg. Yeah. I think pretty consistently, most of the shoreline had a sandy zone within this submarine groundwater discharge zone. And towards the middle, there was, a fair amount of a muck layer, but not as much as we've seen in other similar areas, similar water bodies. But I think the one reason for that is when groundwater discharge pumps through those sediments, it doesn't let the fine grain organics build up in them because it's pumping out at such an effective rate, and it keeps those sandy sediments near the shoreline, which is another way we look for these zones, is to look for areas that do not have a very coarse grain. And many times it determines that the submarine groundwater discharge in strong areas pushes out the fines. And you'll see little riverets on the shoreline and things like that. So there's a lot of hints that nature gives us with that. But because Sagg, north of Bridge Lane, is so effective, so strong in groundwater, we tended to see coarser, sandier areas near the shoreline. And then the middle, was more, the muck and silt layers.
Thanks.
So Molly and Ron, can I ask you each just to answer quickly, what's the favorite thing about Sagg Pond? What do you love about it?
Well, I think what's intriguing to me about Sagg Pond is that it's an embayment size project that we really feel we can change the water quality in.
Yeah.
And there are other areas that it's a big bullet to do something at a level that will actually make a substantial impact. And that attracts me, having done this for a long time, when you get an area that you can bring some hope and healing to. And, it's doable here. And the community has been great, and the access and people supporting it, letting us on their properties, helping us, make this a reality. That's unique, not unique, but that's not always common either. So I think that's what really, working on this project in this area is kind of going to be a benchmark, I think, for other sites.
Molly, what do you think?
Yeah, we've spent quite a bit of time now on the pond, on a boat, looking at the properties, and then we've spent some time now on properties looking back out on the pond, and it's just such a beautiful view. It's just creates a very zen feeling, and just the energy is just very calming. So I think that's one of my favorite parts about spending both time on the pond itself, and then also now getting the opportunity, thanks to the community members who have been so generous and supportive of the project, now being able to look back out on the pond from their properties as well. It's beautiful.
Not a bad view, looking out over the pond out into the ocean. John, what do you think?
Well, I think I think what's exciting, again, I really can relate to what Ron is saying about the size of the pond and the opportunity to have an impact. So I think that's very encouraging, and I think what's brought us this far has been again, tremendous support from people within the watershed and great support from the town. So we want to continue that, and I think we'll have more to say and more money to raise to actually implement some of these PRBs. Again, working in conjunction with the towns and tapping their CPF water quality money. I see Marilyn Clark. Marilyn, can you you're a village a trustee, Sagg Pond.
Hello.
I just want to recognize you. Do you have anything you want to say? And then Anne, if you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation, happy to hear.
Well, I found this very interesting. I'm glad to be able to share this with my colleagues, and also I'm a real estate agent, and I was very interested in learning more from Bruce about how I could encourage people to get more information about changing their septic systems. So the whole project is exciting. I'm glad there's hope, because it's nice to be able to have hope, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Marilyn. Anne?
Thank you.
I just want to echo what so many of you have already said. Just thank you to all of you who are participating in this, and not only at the funding level, but especially at the just leading in such a beautiful way to give us something hopeful to work towards and be able to model, hopefully, in other impacted water bodies. So thanks, you guys.
Thank you, Anne. Anyone else have any final words for us?
I had one quick question. It's Marilyn again. I saw that you were talking about the PRBs behind bulkheads could provide an environmental benefit. And I know you're doing the studies on that. Is that something that could be promoted with people who are redoing their bulkheads? I was just curious about how you saw that, how quickly we'd have information about that.
Yeah, well, I think in the right spot, in Hampton Bays area that we were in had the right drive and the right hydraulics and the right chemistry. And I think it can be very beneficial. I don't know, Molly, correct me, but I think that it's estimated, and this is all early on, that 100 feet of that could be the equivalent of what is reduced from 10 to 20 homes of nitrogen. So, it's kind of amazing you can treat inland, nitrogen at that level. And that's, we're flushing that out better, but that's what's making it a cost-effective approach. So there's more to do with that, but it looks really promising.
Thank
The
you.
work that Molly has kind of spearheaded, so yeah.
Great.
Well, I think that pretty much wraps things up for this evening. So, and our group has dwindled. So I think it's time to say farewell. We will be giving you updates. We will be making a push for some additional funding, before year end, towards the actual installation of some PRBs, at least the initial money to lay the groundwork for that. And so you'll be hearing from us before year end. And again, thank you so much for supporting the effort here through the Sagg Pond Restoration Fund at the Peconic Land Trust.
Thank you, John, Amanda, Josh, and Bruce for your hard work and all the help with our experts from Cornell. Thank you.
Doug, wonderful to see you. Thank you. And thank you, Joan, Mary, Marilyn, and Peggy, whoever else is on. Thank you so much. Good night.